The role of the United States on the North American continent is such that it has seemingly come to define the vast character of this land through the pull of its political influence, military strength, and economic wealth. So much so that those outside of the Americas might not hesitate to identify Canada and even Central America as being unofficial extensions of the United States, or at the very least nations heavily dependent upon it for security and trade. Security which has allowed Canada to reduce defense spending to less than 2% of its GDP, and Mexico to less than 1% of its GDP. Meanwhile, trade from the US makes up between 60 and 80% of Canada and Mexico's imports and exports. It's no surprise then that with its unmatched power in this corner of the globe and historically expansionist aspirations, that attempts by the US have been made through both conquest and compromise to acquire strategically valuable territories from its neighbors or unite with them entirely. The War of 1812 saw the US make an attempt to annex British Canada, and though northern efforts saw little success, in the South authority over formerly Spanish Florida was asserted in the following Seminole Wars, and recently purchased Louisiana was secured from Britain, who had hoped to annex the valuable land surrounding the Mississippi for trade purposes. Just a few decades later, in 1846, the US would find itself at war with Mexico over the annexation of Texas. The Republic of Texas, along with the republics of the Rio Grande and Yucatan, had broken away from an increasingly centralized Mexico in order to preserve their local sovereignty and republican ideals. Texas, along with the Yucatan, managed to hold off a reconquest and proposed annexations of their lands to the US. The Texan bid was accepted on account of its already present majority Anglo-American population, which Mexico had invited through a liberalizing of their immigration policy, hoping that more settlers would deter Native American attacks on Mexican settlements in Texas. The Yucatan bill, on the other hand, after receiving support from the House of Representatives, was shot down by the Senate, who recognized the present civil strife in the Yucatan between the white mixed population and the natives to be a major issue all on its own, which was not worth investing in at that time. The aftermath of the Mexican-American War saw not only the introduction of Texas into the Union, but a majority of what would eventually become the American Southwest. Some decades later, and the US would go to war with Spain for dominance over the remaining Spanish Caribbean, the Philippine Islands, and Guam, bringing the US roughly to its present territorial expanse. These conflicts, along with the Native American Wars and the Civil War, represent the US's only major attempts at military conquest. Other foreign interventions have also occurred, though served purposes outside of integrating new lands into the US. Additional US acquisitions have also been made through means of purchase, compromise, as well as coercive political and military pressure. However, there also exists a number of independent ventures and proposed operations which sought to bring a wide variety of lands under American control, but simply never fully manifested or failed due to a lack of support. Most popular among these are perhaps the filibustering campaigns of physician, lawyer, and adventurer William Walker, who briefly established and ruled republics in northwestern Mexico and Nicaragua with the intention of preparing these lands for union with the United States. These actions were technically illegal as they violated the American Neutrality Act of the time. Though this prevented Walker from receiving direct support from the US government, the favorability of expanding the American domain did allow him to avoid major punishment following his failed expedition in Mexico. And it would be just some years later that Walker would be called upon by the liberal faction of Nicaragua's then ongoing civil war to help them turn the tides of the conflict. Officially contracted by the liberal government, Walker proceeded to defeat the opposing army and assume de facto control over the country. Walker's government in Nicaragua did manage to receive recognition by the US, however, a string of poor alliances and reckless belligerence would soon turn the whole of Central America against Walker's government, this Central American alliance receiving support from foreign companies within Nicaragua, which saw Walker as a threat to their business, and finally drove him out. Individual filibusters aside, there were also proposed annexations set forth by members of the American government, which simply never came to pass. As we already discussed, the Republic of the Yucatan came quite close to being integrated into the United States, but this pales in comparison to what had been in the wake of the Mexican-American War, a plan to annex not just a handful of Mexican states, but Mexico in its entirety. Before going any further, I'd like to take a minute to thank today's sponsor, Ridge Wallet. Look at this wallet. It's pretty nice, isn't it? This is probably how you found it in the store. You thought it looked pretty slim, was made of reliably durable leather, and is fairly stylish. You take it home, and one day later, after filling it up with your belongings, realize this feels really cumbersome in your pocket. Some weeks or months down the line, after having brushed up against your keys or whatever else you might carry in your pockets, the once durable leather begins to chip and peel. There goes your stylish wallet, and now you're off to buy another one, which could cost you anywhere from $20 to over $100. There just has to be a better way. Gentlemen, carrying one of these around is about as outdated as one of those 1980s brick phones. It's high time for an upgrade. Unlike cheap, genuine leather wallets, the aluminum, titanium, and carbon fiber these wallets are made out of won't wear out so easily, and even in the unlikely chance they are damaged, you're guaranteed a lifetime repair and replacement policy, so you'll never need to drop another dime on wallets again. Trends come and go, but the sleek utility and style of these wallets are here to stay. Pick yours up today when you go to ridge.com/MonsieurZ and use promo code MonsieurZ at checkout to get 10% off and free worldwide shipping and returns. Links in the description. Now, back to the video. By the end of the Mexican-American War, the US had occupied not only major settlements in the north, but had also taken the capital and secured significant portions of the Heartland region, putting it in a strong negotiating position post-war. The US occupation was met with significant and brutal resistance by guerrilla combatants, whose abhorrent treatment of captured Americans and desecration of soldiers' remains led occupational commander Winfield Scott to inflict equally brutal conditions upon the Mexican population, who in turn ceased their support for the resistance, whose actions were now seen as being to blame for increased American aggression. During this time, the US was still considering what precisely the terms of peace would be. It had entered the conflict in defense of Texan desires to join the United States, and depending upon the course of war had also hoped to open up what would become the American West Coast for settlement, but now the opportunity to take much more existed, and there were certainly parties which saw the merit in annexing all of Mexico. For many Democrats and Southern politicians, annexation of Mexico would mean anywhere from 5 to 35 new slave states, thus greatly tilting political power towards Southern democratic and agricultural policy. The warmer climate of Mexico would also allow Southern agriculture to diversify its produce to include high-demand crops like sugarcane, coffee beans, bananas, and other tropical fruits, making the United States as a whole much richer. Strategically, there was also a lot to be gained by securing the whole of the Gulf Coast, essentially making of it what amounted to an exclusive American shipyard, from which it could project further influence into the Caribbean. Not to mention the direct land access this would open up to the rest of Central America, lands like Nicaragua and Panama especially, both of which held potential for the creation of a canal which could allow for the easy flow of ships between the east and west coast. Additionally, it had been argued that Mexico and Central America, given their instability at the time, would greatly benefit from direct American oversight, and in turn the US would benefit from not having an unstable neighbor to its south. However, there also existed a great deal of opposition to the All of Mexico movement. For one, it was well understood that this would not be a simple matter of settling underpopulated lands. Mexico already had a fairly large population who would thusly expect due representation and rights as the other states held. Even had this been granted, the American population was expected to resist American settlement in attempts to Americanize the region. Further, it was feared that the division and corruption which plagued Mexico would only spread to the US if its citizens were given political power and free movement throughout the country. And so it was determined that any annexation of Mexico's densely populated lands would not be as an equal state, but as a politically limited territory. There was also much resistance to introducing a population which was largely Catholic and of mixed or indigenous heritage. Prominent statesman John C. Calhoun, a Southerner and pro-slavery politician, mind you, outright rejected this opportunity to create several more slave states, on the basis that demographic incompatibility was a greater threat to American unity. Ultimately, the annexation of Mexico had proven an uncomfortably unprecedented move for the US to make, not even mentioning the great resistance from anti-slavery politicians who refused to grant any additional power to the South. And so the All of Mexico proposal was scrapped in favor of merely annexing Mexico's sparsely populated Northwest territories. But this wouldn't be the last attempt by the South to expand its domain further southward. Fast forward just a few years later and the practice of slavery was being widely abolished across the West. Outside of Africa and Asia, the sole pockets of slavery in the world were parts of the US, the Caribbean, and South America. Slaveholders had a sense that their time was coming to an end, and with that, so might their wealth and agrarian lifestyles be wiped away with it. It was thus considered by some that the southern states and the remaining slave-holding countries across the Americas should come into a union of one form or another for the purpose of preserving their declining and ostracized system. This new union was to be known as the Golden Circle, and originally included the northern United States on the assumption that additional wars in Central America and the Caribbean would soon be launched to balance out the perceived inevitable expansion of the US into Western Canada. These conquests, however, never came to pass. The US resolved many of its territorial disputes with British Canada, and though relations remained strained between the two, missions geared at reconciliation would increase over the coming years. With the North seemingly content in its present land holdings and anti-slavery legislation increasing year by year, so did the dream of the Golden Circle now evolve into a layout for a new country altogether. Northern and Southern stances on slavery, expansion, centralization, and economics, to name a few, all clashed to the point that it seemed compromise and cooperation was no longer feasible. The only solution then was secession, to create two new governments free to move in their own independent directions, unhindered by the other. The leading proponents of this effort were known as the Knights of the Golden Circle, who though heavily focused on the South were headquartered in Ohio. This order held deep connections in the pre-Civil War presidency of James Buchanan, with Buchanan's vice president being a member along with his secretaries of War and Treasury. The order would continue to operate quietly and behind the scenes of the Civil War, supporting Southern secession however they could before ultimately dissolving toward the war's end. Like that, major American plans to invade and conquer its southern neighbors were left in the past. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, the US annexed all of Mexico? We could propose a timeline in which, despite the tremendous resistance to the All of Mexico proposition, pro-annexation Democrats managed to push the movement through. The Democrats, ever since Jackson's presidency, had essentially dominated American politics, and generally that would remain the case until the rise of the Republicans, who replaced the less popular anti-expansionist Whigs, who would only win 2 out of 8 elections against the Democrats. The Whigs, however, would have made significant gains in the earlier midterm election of 1846, which might have swayed the decision one way or the other. We might suggest that had this been different, the All of Mexico proposal could have moved forward, but even still that might not be the case. Remember that we earlier mentioned the Yucatan Bill and how it passed the House of Representatives but was shot down by the Senate? Well, as it turns out, it had been the House of Representatives that the Whigs won and the Senate which the Democrats retained, poking a hole in the likelihood of more Democrats making any major difference in the pursuit of Mexican lands. With that in mind, it may be safe to say that the proposal was plainly unpopular and unlikely, and so, just for the sake of the scenario, we'll assume interest in the proposal is simply more widespread among the Democratic Party and general population. An annexation of Mexico following the Mexican-American War would, as we earlier stated, see the integration of the Mexican states into the US as unincorporated territories, wherein which the Constitution would be in limited effect. The model followed would likely borrow from that which the former president of the Republic of Texas, Samuel Houston, had proposed, in that Mexico's densely populated lands would be treated much like protectorates until they were properly Americanized by a large enough population of US settlers. At that point, proper states would be established and integrated into the Union, but with certain restrictions imposed upon the Mexican citizens, no doubt being perpetually limited in their political power, though eventually being granted more rights and freedoms on par with those of non-voting citizens. Military occupation already in progress would see an escalating campaign against guerrilla activity along the eastern coast, concentrating on the border states Veracruz and moving inward through Puebla and Hidalgo into the Mexico City region. Some might argue such an occupation would prove disastrous, likening it to a Vietnam-style conflict. The coastal territory occupied would be roughly the same size as South Vietnam, the climate and environment would be expected to be quite rough, and the guerrilla combatants would likely be no less brutal. However, unlike that example, Mexico would have no major neighbors to reinforce them as China was able to do for Vietnam. Proximity would also be a major factor for the US as it wouldn't need to transport resources across so far a distance, remaining well within its present spheres of military interest, that being the Gulf region and the Southwest. We should also reflect not merely on this most popular example of failed American occupation in a very different part of the world, but instead on the actual interventions and occupations across Central America and the Caribbean, which actually occurred in our timeline during what was known as the Banana Wars. Conflicts motivated in large part not by the promise of colonization, but in stabilizing these countries through military, political, and financial pressure. On the surface, this might still seem extreme, but in contrast to active efforts at colonization, the tactics used were much more restrained and yet proved repeatedly successful until they were finally abandoned in favor of good neighbor policy. In terms of capability, the US very likely would have the means to effectively subjugate and colonize Mexico over the course of many years. Perhaps the only flaw in such an endeavor would be the question of if the American government and public was willing to sustain and support such a campaign. As we already discussed, the annexation didn't appear to be tremendously popular, however the opportunity opened up would without doubt draw in several investors and settlers to the coastal region, and generate immediate returns for the country which might change the minds of the public to continue this as just another phase of Manifest Destiny. Given that this scenario depends on annexation being a much more attractive prospect from the get-go, we'll just assume that in this alternate timeline, interest in colonization remains high even despite its difficulty. Had Zachary Taylor still become president following Polk, he would have likely made efforts to limit the creation of new slave states out of the newly acquired Mexican territory much as he had in our world, though this could be expected to be reversed following his early passing and succession by the more pro-Southern Millard Fillmore. The Yucatan, then still a separate entity from Mexico and undergoing its own internal unrest, could see support finally lent by the US who would have now heavily invested itself in the region, or alternatively the Yucatan could see eventual intervention by Britain, who held control over neighboring Belize or British Honduras. This American expansion would no doubt signal to Britain the beginning of mass American intervention in Central America and provoke a securing of presently held territories in Belize and the Mosquito Coast of Nicaragua, as well as their surrounding lands. In our timeline, a war nearly broke out between the US and Britain over disputed Nicaraguan lands which might be used to build a canal, but this was ultimately resolved with an agreement to preserve the neutrality of these Central American countries and ensure mutual access and use of such a canal in the future. Despite this agreement, Britain would maintain its presence in the region and only attempt further, albeit minor, annexations. This and disputes over the extent of British authority in Central America would lead to a number of clashes which nearly triggered larger conflicts, but never manifested due to a lack of major investment from either party. With the US now more heavily involved in Central America and Britain recognizing the threat America posed to its possessions, a peaceful resolve is now unlikely and a war could be expected to break out for dominance in Central America around the mid to late 1850s. Assuming by this point new southern states have emerged in the coastal territories of the former Republic of the Rio Grande region in Veracruz and Tabasco, American politics would remain well within Democrat control come the election of 1860. This had been the election in which Lincoln had won the presidency of our timeline, and under similar circumstances, he'd likely still win in this timeline. The reason being that despite Democrat influence, this election had seen their votes split, leaving Lincoln to win with a vote of less than 40%. If we assume Lincoln wins and a civil war still breaks out, the Union would have the potential support of Britain against what has been demonstrated to be a highly aggressive and expansionist South. In our world, Britain had considered supporting the South against the Union, but with a potentially ongoing war in Central America, the Southern Confederates would find themselves locked in a two-front conflict against Britain and the Union. Alternatively, we could propose a timeline in which the growing wealth and potential Mexico has opened up for the South is sufficient to keep the Democrats united and thus maintain the presidency. With Southern power reasserted, but tensions between Democrats and Republicans only worsening by the day, it may actually be the Northern states under the leadership of John C. Fremont who ultimately choose to secede from the South, seeking to pursue their own political agenda free of Democrat interference and end their own participation in the Central American intervention, which overwhelmingly favored the Southern states. This alternate North-South division is less likely to take on a violent character, as the majority of Southern politicians upheld the ideals of individual state sovereignty, self-determination, and decentralization of power, as opposed to the North, which tended to favor strong centralization and unity. The Southern states would also be too preoccupied in their Central American wars to attempt to subdue the North, who would have been a far more formidable adversary than the underdeveloped Central American states. We could imagine in the following years the Union attempting to forge closer relations with Britain against the South, so as to restrict their growth and limit their influence in North America. This would leave the North and South waging a series of minor skirmishes and proxy conflicts, but nothing quite on the scale of the Civil War, as the majority of Unionites, having chosen to break away, would wish to focus on domestic politics first and foremost. Though that being said, there'd be no shortage of animosity between the North and South, relations only becoming worse as the years wore on. In this time, the Confederacy would advance further and further southward, carving out a domain in the northern lands of South America to open up direct access to Brazil. Cuba would be the first Caribbean island to fall under Southern control, then Hispaniola, and eventually the whole of the Greater Antilles, before turning its sights to Britain's few remaining possessions in the region, so as to finally bring together the whole of the Golden Circle. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your Legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.